today is a fascinating Things Hidden episode. I've interviewed our guest today before on radio, and now we're going to do a deep dive on the podcast Things Hidden that you've clicked on today. We have Dr. Richard Koenigsberg, who's the director of Library of Social Science, the Library of Social Science, which seeks to bring significant scholarship into the world. And Dr. Koenigsberg, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me again, David. I appreciate it.
Yeah, now I want to start off for our fans of Rene Girard. You had an interaction with him where you were one of the speakers at one of his events. Can you tell us about what happened?
Okay, so Rene Girard. Now, I write a lot about Galileo, and I write a lot about the nature of science. And science changes according to paradigms. So when something, and I appreciate the fact that you use that word science about my work regularly in the previous interview, because I do conceive of it myself in that way. My PhD, believe it or not, is in experimental psychology. And somehow I took that empirical foundation to the distress of my dissertation supervisor and applied it to studying Hitler. So the paradigms change in relationship to another paradigm. So Rene Girard is my victim. Okay, so people may be fans of him, but in some way my work did have an influence on me, but I'm changing the paradigm and it's in opposition to his paradigm. Okay, so the reality of it, I do book exhibits for a living, and I was invited, or I got to do a book exhibit for Colloquium on Violence and Religion.
What year was this?
This was all those years ago, as George Harrison says about John Lennon's death, 1999.
Okay.
So that would be actually 21 years ago, if my mathematics is held up. So I was interacting with Theo Smith. Do you know him? He was the conference organizer, really nice guy. And this is why I was able to do so much at conferences, because I was the book exhibit manager. So I was there at the highest level talking to the people running the conference, even though they may not have known me as a scholar. So after 3 months of setting up the book exhibit, and I get a lot of stuff in about my work, he invited me to be a keynote speaker. So there I was in the book exhibit in the back with one of my colleagues, and then he called me up and I went onto the stage from my book exhibit. It was a small room, it may have been 120 people. And Rene Girard was in the front row. And I gave my typically radical speech about the killing of the soldiers, among other things, and everybody was totally silent. And there was one lady I had met who I met at the beginning, but everybody was afraid to talk. So after one minute of silence, they pointed to Rene Girard, saying, "Do we have permission to engage with his ideas?" Now, this will tell you something. I'm not criticizing Rene Girard, but every academic group is like that, as I'm sure you know. They have their little ideology, and if your ideas don't fit in to their paradigm, then they tremble with fear. So to my delight, Rene Girard, who is no farther than 8 feet away from me, stood up and said, "Yes, yes, yes." So that was a turning point in my life, really, getting that acknowledgement from him. And then it opened up wildly, all kinds of questions. And it was a great discussion. But me, in my arrogance, on the way out, he wanted to talk to me. But he asked me the wrong question. He says, he said, "What religion are you?" Something like that. And I don't like to get in discussions about what religion I am. I'm not a religious person. So I knew he was going to start hitting me with that his theory about Christianity and how Christ saved the world by revealing the sacrificial mechanism. Now, to go fast forward, almost all the soldiers in the World War I, when they were killed, and when people wrote about it, they said, "I feel like Christ on the cross." So the whole idea that Christ was a negation of the sacrificial mechanism, and I'm not that familiar with the theory, I would say, on the contrary, that soldiers, and I have so much data on this, they're identifying with Christ. They're identifying with the greatest sacrificial victim, and that's the way they can glorify themselves. So in my arrogance, I kind of did not have, I kind of thought it would be hopeless to get into an argument with him about religion. I'm more tolerant now, as I'm sure you can see, than I used to be. I would have just, had a cup of coffee with him, and we would have had a talk. So that was 1999. And then in 2000, and then I presented again in 2000, but it was not that, I don't remember it that clearly. But then in 2001, Sander Goodall, you may know that name, he invited me again to be a keynote speaker. And all of these things, of course, are I write about continually. That's the way I get control of my life. This time, Rene Girard was in the farthest back of the room as opposed to the front. He was having a cup of coffee, and I could see at this point he didn't want to have any part of me, because he's the star of that show and always will be. So I gave my talk, and it was again very well received. And a guy who owned a lecture bureau met me on the way out, and we had a cup of coffee, and that led to me being a speaker and making some money from it, which I'm not doing now, by the way. He became my lecture coach and the guy who signed me up for speaking at colleges and everything. So, and then after that, in 2002, he was in the book exhibit room, and he was rapping with other people. And by that time, I could see, I was listening to him, and the person who was running the book exhibit with me, a brilliant young man, didn't like him. He was, I don't know, he was off on a tangent. And the last thing that happened in connection, no, it's not the last. So then that guy, the guy who writes the column, you remember the guy who writes the column continually, he's a big shot there. Every week he puts out a column. He wrote about me, and it was pretty positive. Although, again, so that was kind of, and then the next year, 2 years, I was going to do a book exhibit again. And I said, well, can I speak again? I'm not going to, this was in the far West. I said, I'm not going to go all the way out there just for a book exhibit. I have many book exhibits, but if you'll, so for the first time in history, a normal conference, not one of they wanted to pay me not to speak. They wanted to pay me to do the book exhibit, which I usually do for free, right? Because I make money from the publisher fees. That's how I earned a living, by the way, all these years. And that's how I kept, you've done a pretty great job of keeping independent of the encroaching world and academic community. My mechanism was to earn a living from doing book exhibits, and therefore they had no hold on me. And they, as a book exhibitor, all the professors were friendly to me. I actually was promoted to assistant professor when I was a little younger, actually, than your age. And I quit teaching forever.
Yeah, that's interesting. So then fast forward, just for those who are fans of a more contemporary figure in cultural conversations. Dr. Jordan Peterson ended up referencing your work in one of his lectures, right? Tell us a little bit about what he referenced and what he got wrong.
Okay, so basically, people get a hold of my book. It's offered for sale through me, and it was
Your
also
book called what?
Hitler's Ideology: A Study in Psychoanalytic Sociology. It's
Okay.
available as an ebook on my website, librarysocialscience.com. It's available on Amazon. But I had a relationship with another publishing company, International Age Publications, and he did a reprint. That's his world. He does reprints of books that are fairly successful. So Jordan Peterson purchased a copy from him. Jordan Peterson is obviously a genius and does so many different things. That's, in my view, his fault. I mean, most scholars become specialists and be great in one area. He will talk on every known subject, right? Yeah. And it seems like he knows something about, and he doesn't have notes. So no wonder he had a nervous breakdown. I want to warn him, he's going to have a nervous breakdown. You mark my words. Nobody can do what he's doing continually on every subject and present himself as world's greatest expert. Okay, so that's a prolegomenon, if that's a word. So most of the people that I interact with and that are on my mailing list are specialists in Nazi Germany. He had the nerve to do one of his 2-hour classroom sessions on Nazi Germany. And to be honest, it was pretty damn good. And he overcame some of the shibboleths of the scholars. He wasn't held back by the conventional points of view. All right, so then he came to my book. To my surprise, he said, now I want to show you something. He put it on the screen, and he did a very good job of showing the book. And he read, so my methodology, we may as well get this in there, is to look at metaphors in the writings of political speeches. This is my basic technique, which I developed immediately after my PhD, recurring metaphors. So when I tried to get it published, my first book, some people didn't even think it was a book because I was so fanatic about data that the data would take up like 10 pages and the interpretations would take up 2 pages. So the head of Random House said, why don't you make this into more of a narrative book and we can publish it? And I said, no, that's not what I'm trying to do. There's plenty of books written on Hitler's life and the history of Nazi Germany. And at that point, David, I didn't know that much about Nazi Germany. I just knew about Hitler's metaphors. So that's the way I arrived at the ideology of the individual. And you can do it for anybody by looking at these underlying metaphors. This technique, again, I was too early in so many ways, was developed by George Lakoff 8 years later and Johnson, with whom I've also had some contact. The simple idea of looking at metaphors as revealing the deep structure of an ideology. And his colleague, actually, Johnson, is actually more interesting than him, and he has a couple of pictures on his website. In any case, where was I?
We're talking about Jordan Peterson.
Yes. All right. So he put on the screen the metaphors of Hitler. So Hitler's basic metaphor was that the Jew was a disease within the body of the country, the nation, Germany. So, I mean, if you want to understand extermination in a simple way, it was not complicated because he said it actually just before the final solution began, which was, as you recognize, June 1941. He talking to people, and they have quotes on this, the Jew is the bacteria in the body of mankind. In order to save the nation and save the world, by the way, you have to eliminate the Jewish bacteria. So he read all these quotes, and again, this guy is a fanatic. He didn't stop at reading one page. He read 4 pages, 5 minutes, and all the quotes are very similar. And he was constantly astonished. He would go, "Oh gosh, look at what he's saying here." So he of course, he properly connects up the extermination with the imagery. That was fine. But then he says he has some theory of disgust, and he's saying that somehow the Jew evoked disgust in Hitler. Somehow these biological images turned his stomach. And there's actually an online article on this. And nothing could be further from the truth. Here's where people misunderstand Hitler. I could say something very politically incorrect now, but I won't take a chance. But Hitler was brilliant, and what he was doing was symbolic. So he was the Jew, the bacteria image represented the idea that the Jew was the negation of the pure body. I think you used that term once, the pure German body. And somehow it was what the Jew believed that was the negation. So he used the idea of bacteria as something that negated the truth of his ideology. And he said it very clearly. The Jew was what he called a selfish individualist. Who had never understood the joy of belonging to this wonderful community. So the Jew in his mind was a party pooper. And that's what he meant. He didn't fit in. And that's why, and he couldn't bear it. Now, why he couldn't bear it, most people would say, well, let live and let live. Some people don't believe, but that's the nature of a dictator, right? Everybody has to believe in their ideology. So he identified the Jew as a people that not only did not believe in his ideology, but was incapable of believing it. They couldn't be reformed. You'd think you just take them to reform school, right? And teach them. And they would have joined the Nazi party, no doubt, if he hadn't had this idea of the Jew as the disbeliever. The easiest way to understand that is through bin Laden. I use the term death to the non-believer before I had any understanding of Islam. But it's similar in the sense, people, in the United States, they're not necessarily against Muslims, right? I mean, I'm sure people in the World Trade Center didn't give a shit about Muslims or Islam for most of them. But in his mind, the very idea of America was the negation of the idea of the belief of the Muslim. So and this is where you took off in the thing you read, that he was killing a belief system.
Yeah, let's read that piece here. Now, this is from your newsletter. The purpose of political violence is not killing, but getting others to die. Political violence is undertaken in the name of an ideal considered sacred by a leader or members of a given society. Willingness to kill testifies to the reality and power of a sacred ideal. The proof of the pudding is in the dying. The fundamental objective of political violence is not killing, but getting others to die in the name of the sacred ideal. The people who must die are those who don't fully embrace the sacred ideal, who oppose the sacred ideal, or whose own ideals contradict or negate one society's sacred ideal. The others who must die may be people of another society or members of one's own society.
Very good. Yeah, that's it. That's it. And it's great that you identified that, because remember, on the outskirts of my mind is evolutionary psychology. Okay, you cannot avoid that discipline, which is so prevalent nowadays. But many people can vote for something and it may be completely fallacious, as we've learned. I mean, the idea that a lot of people go thumbs up and and say this is true doesn't mean something is true. They used to believe in witches. So this idea of evolutionary of male aggression, and this is as the source of all these horrible things is ridiculous. The whole idea of tracing it back to something that happened like 10,000 years ago, when men were primitive, before they had this highly symbolic culture. One of my colleagues who died recently, Jay Bernstein, he says, how do you know? Were you there? Were you there? In any case, what evolved is not, males. I always use Saving Private Ryan as an example, right? Can anybody, and you can tell me how anybody, and this is how fixated this idea is and how rigid these academics are. Can anybody tell me? And remember, the people who ran onto the shore, those poor young men, were from every known culture. Can anybody tell me how they were expressing their male aggression and how their genes were going to be reproduced, at Omaha Beach? Can anybody tell me?
Well, what if they said that they were hoping to survive and they would get the glory of the ticker tape parade, which would get their genes to reproduce?
Okay, you could say that, but the thing is, it wasn't male aggression that they were expressing. They were just trying to survive. It's not like, I use the term, I don't know if I can curse on your show. It wasn't like they were bad motherfuckers. That the whole idea of male aggression goes on some, like a serial killer, right? Like Jeffrey Dahmer, someone who's really mean and wants to really harm people. You can't say they were trying to harm the Germans. They were just trying to survive. So there's so many examples like that. And by the way, the generals who run the whole thing know this. And there's one general, one famous general that I quote. Let me see if I can find what he says.
This is in World War II?
This is in World War II. Yeah. Do you have that? Let me find, it's not far away from me. Anyway, he says that the people who think that men are expressing some aggressive drives, are mentally ill, because it's just not something that, in World War II, by the way, there's a study that they showed that only 19% of the men fired a rifle in the midst of battle. They couldn't even do that. And of course, and that's why they go through basic training, right? They have to brainwash them into believing they're bad motherfuckers. And I studied that a little bit.
Isn't there a baseline of testosterone fueled physical aggression that is being used by these military school, training to weaponize it for their glorious national cause? I
always thought the word testosterone, which referred to sex. And I like to have a lot of testosterone at my age so I can continue on my project. Now, is sexuality a form of aggression? That's an interesting question. I mean, people talk about romantic love, right? And all the movies, love, they make love is a many tendered thing, et cetera. If you've ever had sex, there's a pretty strong aggressive component in it, right? It's not like, oh, darling, you're so sweet. It's like, I'm not going to use any words, but there is a very powerful aggressive component to sexuality. It doesn't mean, and this has been written about by psychoanalysts, it doesn't mean you dislike the woman, but you're certainly conquering her in some way. And that's where the testosterone comes in. But the idea of connecting violence, why is violence connected to sexuality?
But would you say it's true that men are more likely to engage in physical violence with their peers than women on average?
Yes, this is the myth. This is the myth propagated by, and men accepted because they want to think they're bad motherfuckers. But you show me a man who dominates his wife. It is very rare, usually the aggressive one in the family. So no, I do not think, yes, men are trained to be aggressive. Now, is sports a form of aggression? No, I don't think so. It's a form of determination and the desire to be great. When I was running long distance running, okay, that was my main sport. Was that aggression? No, it was determination. It was will. And it may be that there was a sexual energy that went into it, because I knew that, yeah, the girls like me. Some of them may have liked me better. They liked the athletes, right? But that's not because they're more aggressive.
But aren't sports kind of like sublimated forms of nonviolent war rituals? You know what I mean? I mean, you're tackling people, or you're kind of pushing somebody out of the way to slam dunk the basketball, or you know what I mean? Isn't there kind of a sublimated, battle ritual taking place in a lot of those sports, even though it's not supposed to be violent?
Energy, but first of all, in my long distance running, at the end of a meet, the guys that I beat or the guys that beat me, they would come over and shake your hand. And there was a great compassion. There was no anger, no violence whatsoever. And you see that in football as well. I often laugh at the whole notion of, not accepting defeat. If you see the end of a football game, it's never happened where a coach, they come over, they shake their hand, they congratulate the other players. They're not angry at them. They say, you did a great job. We were lucky to win. And there's never been a time in the history of football where a coach, a year later said, we actually won the game. That person would be considered psychotic. You're mistaken. It's final. I was watching a lot of World Series videos, and it's the same thing. It's this compassion. So what is the nature of the energy?
But violence spills out in sports games when there's a perception that the rules were not enforced properly. Have you noticed that? Like soccer riots?
Oh, there are such rigorous enforcement of rules. It's almost,
if they feel like the ref was cheating them out of the win, that's when you typically will get like a riot or something that will spill out of a soccer stadium, because they feel like.
I enjoyed the baseball riots because the umpires have such dominance, but you're not even allowed to touch an umpire. He controls the game. Billy Martin used to kick dirt on the umpire, and he gets fined $10,000. They thought he was so aggressive. So the great thing about sports is that it's confined and it's so rule-based, and it's so rigorously rule-based that anybody that tries to break the rules, like this recent guy, for, with the drugs, they are vilified. They become villains, these few that try to break the rules, like by using drugs.
They say I think there's domestic violence upticks in cities when their sports team loses. Have you any idea about what's causing that?
Well, yeah, there's the narcissistic blow. I mean, people, it's the same, David, as nationalism. When you lose, you feel hurt and you get angry. We used to have a frustration aggression hypothesis all those years ago. It's the narcissistic injury that causes the violence. Now, the males probably beat their wives more than wives beat men, but this is because they are hurt by something the wife says, to humiliate him. He's hurt, and therefore he strikes back. Maya calls me names all the time. And if I wasn't coming on this interview today, I never hit her once. I threw my glasses across the room once. But the thing is that women can really humiliate men and have look at what's happening with this poor black guy who stood by his woman, right? Will Smith at the Academy Awards. You know that story of following the mass culture. And what's she doing? She's having affairs with other guys, and now she wants to divorce him. So in my experience, in my family, my mother was dominant over my father. My uncle, my Aunt Norma was dominant over my Uncle Sam. So in reality, in the microcosm of your home, the woman is usually the dominant force and the one that runs the whole thing. And the poor men has to go out and earn a living and bring the money back and give it to the woman. And some women demand more money, in order to get to go out with them, you have to give them a $500,000 jewel. You see this, right? These great movie actresses and poor people that are like Michael Douglas. He has to give this woman half his age. He has to kowtow to her, and she's kind of patting him on the head. So, I think a lot of
to challenge to provide evidence against the thesis that male aggression is not bubbling up into the war behavior. You could look at the statistics of males committing most of the violent crimes, but then to give evidence in support of your thesis, you could say, well, statistically speaking, the vast majority of males committing violent crime are usually raised by single mothers. So it kind of goes back and forth there, right?
They're usually, all right, here's another way of sparsing it. Again, I don't use these words too often because I don't talk to many educated people. Another way of sparsing, the people who do it in, quote, real life are usually criminals and are identified as criminals and are more than likely abnormal people. Like nobody would say Jeffrey Dahmer was a normal person, cutting people up, all the things they do. Whereas the man in the military, he's admired for his aggression. And why is that? And that's where the country comes in. And that's the key to deconstructing the whole mess, is somehow when you put the things together, the male, whatever you want to call it, aggression becomes something real only because he's doing it in the name of the country.
It is interesting that I've always found it interesting, like, for example, within the on the left wing side of politics, like there's this hypersensitivity to unjust, and it's not a negative thing in itself, but it can be when it's misunderstood, misapplied or whatever. But there's a sensitivity to unjust police killings or brutality towards people in our own country, like with George Floyd. But there's a total disregard for deaths on the battlefield. I was always strange how people could be, they would wear a t-shirt of, George Floyd or Eric Garner, who were killed from police actions, and they felt that they were killed and treated more brutally because of their skin color. But yet they had no similar feeling of compassion for, say, the drone strikes that were killing Afghani people that, Biden was dropping. He killed that family of innocent people as retaliation to the 12 Marines dying. And there wasn't the same level of sensitivity towards the murder of those Marines on our side or the Afghani civilians that Biden had to retaliate to try to save face for. They're just is it because they're from a far off country and the cameras are not zooming in on their?
I don't think they have great compassion for our own soldiers. Right. I don't think you'll find left-wing people marching to welcome our soldiers home. Maybe once in World War II, when everybody was glad. When Hitler was a great one for everybody, right? Because he made death and violence justifiable. But I doubt if you find left-wing types at a victory parade for the soldiers, okay? But there's a deeper point with the left wing. And again, you have to realize, I don't want to say you have to realize, that's too arrogant. You're almost there of recognizing that a lot of human culture is psychotic. So this whole admiration for communism among the left wing, okay, which goes right back. I mean, Lenin was a murderer right from the beginning. In order to take power, he murdered about 1 million people. And then Stalin came on and he murdered a total of 33 40 million people total before you ever heard of Hitler. Now they're beginning to write about this now, right? Thank God, because the archives have been open in Russia. So there's some great books that you can look up by scholars of Soviet Russia. But the whole way the left wing actually became communist and did not acknowledge the violence of, and even Zizek. I wonder what Zizek is saying now about the greatness of communism with these people. Basically, Putin is a communist. I mean, this is his, I haven't gone into deeply to his ideology, but of course, he was a KBG man, and it's still in his mind to resurrect communism. What are they saying now about the greatness of communism when he's going in and just slaughtering people for no reason at all? How I would wonder what Zizek would say now about communism. But you're well aware that all of these left-wing people go back to Marx and if only blah, 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 Marx. I never found anything in him to be true. And you know, this is one reason. Now, the people that I studied with were not into that sort of thing, like Norman O'Brien. He was not. Some people try to pretend that he was a Marxist, you know, because Herbert Marcuse wrote a follow-up book, and he was a little bit of Marxist. But the whole idea of yes, there is oppression in the sense that you know, the people at McDonald's work very hard for what, $8 an hour? I see them working night and day. Corporations do take advantage. How much, ma'am? 15. It's gone up. Okay. They do work very hard. They do work lower class people very hard in order to make a profit. Okay, but that's different than killing. I don't connect corporate greed with you know, with the violent people, you know. So what are you going to do? You going to kill the managers of Dunkin' Donuts because they make so much money? Yeah, it seems unfair. I never cared. I mean, you know, I don't see the great. I don't, you know, if I have $1 million or 2 million, that'd be fine for me. I never fetishized money. Now Maya does, you know, she had a guy that took her in when she came, a million, you know, constantly talking about large amounts of money. For what? What is it going to do? Oh, Steve Jobs has $1 million, or what's the new guy? This great scientist, this brilliant man that, with the algorithms, and what's his name? It owns
Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or who?
No, the other one.
Zuckerberg?
No, the other one, the one that does good things.
Elon Musk?
No.
Bill Gates?
No. One more.
Bezos?
That enables us to buy $25 books for $2.50.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a revolution, and they deliver the motherfuckers in like overnight. I say, please, you don't have to deliver them the next day. I can wait one day, you know, and they do it. They come on a Sunday morning. I order it Saturday night, and I don't need the pens that badly. Yeah, they're running out, but please do it on Monday. Let the guy relax. So I'm not, so this kind of fanaticism, you know, that they may be doing good things or doing bad things, but I don't, it doesn't bother me. Let's say, I understand that they are taking advantage of people who are making lower wages, but it's not like it's not like there's going to be a Marxist revolution where the people at McDonald's are going to raise up their pitchforks, and I don't think they even know where the managers are located. I mean, the whole left-wing fantasy is so ridiculous that this is probably the first time I ever even commented on it.
What's your you know, you criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but do you also see your theory helping to explain the NATO side of this conflict? I mean, I think Pope Francis was correct when he said that NATO was like a barking dog on Putin's door, on Russia's door, starting in 2014, you know, where the Maidan Revolution, and then that Ukrainian government comes to power after the Maidan Revolution, ousts the guy who was a little too close to Russia. And then you've got this this kind of conflict going on in the Donbass region. They immediately passed legislation outlawing the speaking of Russian for people that almost half the country are Russian speakers. So then you go into Donbass, you see children being killed. The Western Ukrainian government is persecuting violently their own citizens in the Eastern Ukraine. Of course, it just becomes this, as Rene Girard would say, kind of mimetic doubles, because you see persecution taking place against innocents on the Western Ukraine side and the Eastern and Russia. So what's the explanation for why the Ukrainian government felt the need to outlaw the speaking of Russian, such that you would literally be fined if you said "Dobro Utra" in the good morning, in a grocery store?
How come Americans don't like people when they speak Spanish?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an idea of a consistent country. It's
the same thing you said, right? The idea of eliminating impurities from the body, right?
Well, but it's not so extreme. The idea that you can't speak, may I use the term national? I mean, basically, we disagree on this kind of an issue. But the idea of saying that we would, like Spanish people in the United States, me no speak the English. I was just talking to Maya. There's a guy in our who does the tasks around the house. What do they call it? Janitor, I guess we used to call it. Now they call it a building administrator or whatever. He speaks Spanish, and I'm telling Maya that he does it because he don't want to be bothered. He can understand English. But the whole idea of me no speaking the English, when I used to pick up Spanish women, they used to say that, me no speaking English. I might take them home anyway. I didn't need to talk to them that much. But the whole idea that everybody has to speak the language, that's part of nationalism. So that's Ukrainian nationalism. But
what about Azov Battalion resurrecting those Nazi symbols? You were an expert on the Nazi symbology. Why do you think the Azov Battalion is trying to bring those symbols back to the fore of their conflict?
Well, I don't know enough about this, David.
Yeah.
But as far as I can tell, the guy in charge of Ukraine seems like a nice fellow, and he doesn't seem like a vicious killer. And I'm sure the Ukrainians would prefer not to fight this war, which is why I constantly call it a terrorist attack. It's not like they were actually, maybe borders, whatever. It's not like they were going to Russia and with machine guns and killing Russian. It was a terrorist attack, unbeknownst to the Ukrainians. They just started killing people, and they've killed what?
Well, they were killing, but the Western Ukrainian government was killing their own citizens in the eastern part of Ukraine. So there's blame on both sides. I think that a more neutral position on these wars would be actually more in keeping with the implications of your theory that all of these different countries ultimately end up sacrificing their own soldiers for the reminder of what it means to be a nation. I think.
So what do you think of the Revolutionary War in America?
I think it's in keeping with what your theory says.
Well, but you don't take a theory and apply it everywhere.
I'm applying your theory.
Well, you don't have to apply it everywhere because I'm happy to be an American. I'm happy that British are not dominating us.
Well, now, you can take a subjective, like there are good things that can happen from things that you can objectively analyze as being a kind of I don't want to say the word mechanistic, but kind of something that's going to happen. For example, in the Revolutionary War, you have oligarchs in the revolutionary side that are fighting off other oligarchs from the British oligarchs. So it doesn't mean that there's nothing good out of it, but you can look at it and you can say they're trying to preserve their national body and conceive of it in a way that the British Empire says, no, that's my body. That's part of my body. And the other ones are saying, no, actually, what you call a parasite or a bacteria in your body, we actually consider it to be a distinct body. And we're going to we're going to separate away from you. And we're going to define our body, and we're going to eliminate any impurities or bacteria, which would be the loyalists.
Too complicated for me. The nature of science, David, is that you take the simplest possible cases to start out with. And then you may extend the theory, and I have problems with over 30, 40-year period to extend to other cases. But what you're doing is going too fast. You're taking the theory and immediately extending it. So most theory formation in any science, they start with the most basic thing. You know, they develop like the atoms and electrons before they all the strong force and the weak force and all these motherfucking things that they're
but I want to make clarification then. When you say the purpose of political violence is not killing, but getting others to die, you don't mean that in all the cases. That's what you're saying.
Well, I'm starting out where it's hard enough, David, to get people to view this simple case of not.
I guess I'm more Koenigsberg than you are, because I take it to be all the wars.
You're younger. You're trying to go too far. Now, if you are a performer, which is what you are as well, then you can go further because you're also an entertainer.
But it's not meant to be entertaining. I'm just trying to, I see what you say, and I think that has everything to do with pretty much all the different wars.
All right.
All political violence.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know all those wars.
Yeah.
And I would not say it until I'd actually studied the individual cases. So if you were a scientist, you would take one of the things you've mentioned and you'd write a paper on it and show how Koenigsberg's theory also explains such and such. But the only thing I know about is Nazism, Leninism, Stalinism, a little bit about Mao, and I also gave a lecture for which I was paid on the Iraq War. This was the lecture guy who brought me in, and I studied. That was the first contemporary thing that I studied. Was the Iraq War. So what's happening now is in a way very fortunate for me, because some people would say, well, you just study ancient history. But what this guy is doing, this Putin, goes back to Lenin. I mean, it's not like his ideology is different than Lenin's. There's a direct line of development in communism. It's not like communism is dead. It's not like it ended with the Cold War. So there is a relationship between everything. I mean, some things that happened in the past resurrect themselves. I mean, my wife's mother had 8 children. Mm-hmm. Now, that was in, 1950. Now, that come from Copernicus. Excuse me, that's a slip of the tongue. That came from Confucius. So the Confucius principles that were laid down 3,000 years ago are still now the foundation for Chinese culture. No matter how modern they get, there's a part of their brain which is still ancient, and that's true of every culture. The things, why is Aristotle and Plato so popular? There's still something in the Western mind that goes back to Aristotle. Why is Thomas Aquinas still popular? There's still something in the Catholic mind that goes back to Thomas Aquinas and to Martin Luther. Although nobody would say with Thomas Aquinas how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. That part would be obscure and not valid scientifically, although it depends on how big the angels are.
From the national perspective of a nation, the collective spirit of a nation, or psychological state of being a part of a nation, is there a difference in the meaning of the death of a soldier versus the death of a foreign combatant fighting your own soldier?
No, it's all part of the idea of dying for the sacred ideal.
So there's no distinction in your understanding between the foreign combatant dying and and your own soldier dying on that conflict.
On some level, it goes even deeper than that. Okay, it goes even deeper, and that is, and here's here's where I go deeper than anyone. Is the goal is to sacrifice, period. And I have something here that I can read from Oliver Wendell Holmes. Do you remember him?
No, go ahead.
He was this famous lawyer that ran for president. Okay. And this is something, one of my colleagues, Michael Vlahos, has trouble with. And Michael Vlahos actually was my one colleague that I could talk to these things about. He had a high position at a military institute, not a military institute, naval war college, very sophisticated. And finally, he lost his job when he was against the Iraq War. So I became colleagues with him, and we used to meet at Penn Station and have long conversations. But here's what Oliver Wendell Holmes, and this gets to this idea that the idea is dying, period, sacrificing, and that is what elevates the country. So without even making the distinction you made, he says, I don't know what is true, but I do not know the meaning of the universe. But in the midst of doubt, in the collapse of creeds, there is one thing I do not doubt, that no man who lives in this same world with most of us can doubt. And that is that faith is true and obedience which leads a soldier to throw away his life in obedience to a blindly accepted duty, in a cause which he little understands, in a plan of campaign of which he has little notion, under tactics of which he does not see the use. So what he's saying there, which I then analyze, he says it's adorable for the soldier to die, or we might say to sacrifice his life. The whole idea that you're willing to give your life, and it doesn't matter what the fucking cause is, it's adorable that he's willing to go so far as to give his life for, in this case, the nation. And this is basically what I'm saying, is that somehow the idea of dying is considered a good thing because what? It elevates the nation. It makes us believe there is something superordinate to actual human existence. What is fucking human existence? Is getting up in the morning, having a cup of coffee, coming to your desk, talking to your wife and your children, taking a drive in the car and getting some apples if you live in the countryside, and going to Staples and buying. That's your real life, right? And you probably have a real life. I don't have that much of a real life because I spent too much time studying this stuff. But I do those things. I go to the mall. I sit in the mall. I have a McDonald's frappe and nothing like that. But there's also this superordinate realm of existence, which most everybody, not everybody, there are people that just do their own life. And those very often are the people that get rich, the people that just, you do their own business, right? But meanwhile, there's all these other people that are constantly, including me, I don't rule myself, that are plugging into all these international affairs. Now, before Donald Trump, I was very happy in politics if I didn't have to pay any attention. I stopped reading newspapers for 4 years and started going to Chinese movies. And I didn't miss it. When I get back, they were still talking about Reagan. So I'm saying there is a way of being where you don't connect to these superordinate things, but people need it so desperately. And that's the psychological question that is so important. Why do people plug in to all these things that have resulted in endless misery? Whoever you can blame this or that or this, but there's been 200 million people killed in the 20th century, David. And some scholars like Rummel make it even higher. And you can say, oh, that was because of that the war, and that was because the Bolivians were the aristocrats and the landlords. There could be 100 reasons, but the fundamental idea is that all these people have died. And that's what I'm pointing to the use of death as a way of elevating some superordinate entity, which you could call the nation or you could call Allah.
How does the death elevate the nation's sense of transcendence? How does
Because
death itself, how does a soldier going off to die, what is the actual connection between that event and the elevation of the nation's, body and sense of vision and purpose?
I mean, this is a good way of phrasing the question, because it's so damn important, this other entity, that you're willing to give your life.
Okay, so the idea that someone would die for the nation helps remind people who believe in the nation's existence that their national identity means something because someone was willing to let their body be destroyed for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a simple idea.
Yeah.
In Hong Kong, the women, when they break up with the man, they jump off a high building. So of course that's saying this man is so important to me that I'm willing to jump off a high building. The people in the World Trade Center. Let's look at the perpetrators themselves. People forget they were in the rubble too. Don't we forget that they were? It's not just Americans that died; they all died too. In some way, we think that somehow they exist. But so the idea is that this entity that we worship is so important that we're willing to die for it. And the fact that they're willing to die for it makes people scratch their heads and say, it must be really real. As we used to say at University of Michigan, the young black girl, the really real, the music, right? Where are you, by the way?
Florida. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I remember now. Okay, so it must be real. Nobody could be crazy enough to die for nothing. So the fact that people are dying is the independent variable, and this is my most radical, gives rise to the idea of the country. Now, you may say that the fact that all these people die for Allah, do you believe in Allah more now?
Well, I'm not in that country, so I wouldn't have that.
No, we're not talking about country. Where they think they were convincing the world that because they're willing to die for the entity, it must be ultimately real. But it didn't convince you that Allah was ultimately real.
But it wasn't meant to convince me. It was meant to convince the people who's they're speaking for.
Everybody. All these ideologies are world ideologies. They want to convince everybody in the belief in Allah that it's a world religion. It's probably the most popular religion. They're not just dying for their own people. They're trying to persuade us to believe in Muslim. Look at how powerful our God is. And it's true of every country. Look how powerful Germany is.
But it doesn't persuade us as much because we're not from that. Because see, there's no distinction in my worldview between the word religion and nation. I believe that nation states are simply a modern vestige of religion, and there's no distinction. They're synonymous. And if you're in the ancient world, there was no word for religion. Religion is a word that comes from the West, where we start naming, okay, well, that's a religion. There was no category for religion. It was just, this is who I am. If I am in Persia, this is our God. This is who we are. You didn't pick it. You didn't get to an age when you were 7 years old in ancient Persia and say, you know what? I think I've decided I'm going to follow the religion. No, it was just, if you are a Persian, you are with this worldview. And then the modern world comes along and tries to act like religion waves away.
By the way, you said if you're a Persian, you're a Persian. So again, these are complicated issues. Don't simplify. So what's more important, the country or the religion? You didn't even say probably you don't even know what religion the Persians were. You said the religion comes first. Maybe the nation comes first. And yes, I agree with you. That is religion. But I wouldn't say that. You said Persian. You didn't. What is the Persian religion? Do you know?
There's the religion of, they used to talk about it as the religion of the telling of spreading the light, the truth. They wanted to spread the light into the darkness.
There's a name for it.
Yeah.
But it's not as important as Persia, because
Yeah.
that's what you
So in your
said.
mind, the nation comes before religion.
It may, but again,
Yeah.
you don't have to answer. You're 33. You don't have to answer. This would be a very important study. Okay, so Greece. Who did Greece worship more? Greece or those little stupid fucking gods they had? They had a lot of gods in Greece, right?
Yeah.
That they the icons, you know. Chinese have a lot of gods. Okay, they don't take them seriously. I went to a lot of Chinese movies, right? They have
Yeah.
all kind of little gods here and there, but they're not frightened of them. They, in the movies, they roam around in outer space, you know, they fly, but they're almost like a joke.
Gerard said that those gods are deified victims from their past memory. They're remembering their victims of sacrifice as gods because they gave them such peace that it created an ecstatic sense of tranquility and belonging between people who were in conflict prior to the murder of the
Too
scapegoat.
complex. The Chinese god is China. All those little icons are insignificant compared with the culture itself, which you can call China.
I would say now you're correct, but I'd say in the previous time periods, they didn't have a concept of nationhood like we think of today, but rather those gods were in the place of where the nation is now. I think you're correct today.
You studied this, David?
What's that?
You studied this?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I've studied ancient China. And in the first century, when China became a nation, the king or whatever they call the emperor, they killed almost everybody else, so many people to establish the Chinese, whatever you want to call it. You may not call it a nation, but it was
Kingdom.
an entity.
Yeah.
It was whatever you call it. It was an entity that people were devoted to. So the China starts very early. It's not a nation in the same as the West. Now, in the West, there's this book by Kantorowicz, which is one of the greatest books ever written, where he does trace the nation to the church. He says the church was the first omnipotent object. And if you remember, since you're a Christian, the church united all the people into one body, right? Galatians, they all in one body in Christ's body. So he demonstrates, and a lot of my work on the body politic comes from this book, that the nation gradually evolved out of the church. And then it became, the nation became the church. But this is one of the great, if you read one book in the next year, I'll send you some newsletters on it, and that can get you started. Ernest Kantorowicz. So he does trace the nation state to the Christian religion. But it was early that this started. It was maybe in the 11th century where it began to transform from the church into a nation. But he traces, it's such a beautiful book. So the body politic idea comes from, and I actually, I taught in class when I was very young on St. Paul. I'm not an expert on Christianity, but I took that one, his writings, I don't know what you call them, the epistles, and I analyzed those. And those are he is the core of the Christian religion. And all these ideas about the body of the church and the body politic, it all evolves from St. Paul.
I agree. Yeah. And I think that the roots of sacrifice, I think, start the sacrificial deaths that you're referring to, I do think precede any concept of a nation state. The nation state is the modern vestige of the archaic sacred that this comes from. You can look at Neanderthals. There's evidence that they were doing burial rites, and there was some ritual cannibalism in the Neanderthal community. So we know there wasn't any what we would consider to be a modern nation state for Neanderthal.
All right, but again, I think you actually may have written, or there's a photograph in that paper of yours I published of a pyramid. So yes, you're right. But we're talking about grandiose things. We're not talking about little things. The pyramid is a sacrifice. The pyramid, think of how many man hours, and it was all for the pharaoh And for the pyramid itself, think of how rich they could have been if they didn't know how to build a pharaoh. Think of it. They spent all,
So you're right. It shows what you're saying there gives evidence to the idea that this is not something done from some kind of Darwinian survival mechanism.
Yes.
Because there's nothing Darwinian survival about, building giant pyramids for people. And
I use that example many times, but I once was at a conference where I was running the book exhibit, and a guy saw my theories. It's something like that, the pyramid as a sacrificial vehicle, nothing to do whatsoever. And there was a very famous evolutionary person who used to be not an evolutionary person. They've been brainwashed. He came over to my table, and his friend was kind of making fun of them, showing him my theories. And he said, "Look at this." And the guy just sat there for 4 minutes looking at it. He had nothing to say. He could not dispute he's a nice guy, but he's not like he's going to get in a fist fight with me or something, as some people do over theories. But no, the pyramid is perhaps the most obvious example of when we became human and we're willing to devote all those hours to immortality. And by the way, there's another writer that talks about this, and that's Sheldon Solomon. Do you know him?
No.
He writes about the denial of death. Mm-hmm. But even he throws a bone to evolutionary psychology, even though Scott Atran, I had a 3-hour conversation with him. He's a brilliant man. And I just published something. You can look at what I published online today in the newsletter. He also is talking about sacrifice for the sacred object. But I don't want to humiliate. There's nothing in his writing that would show that he actually believes in evolutionary psychology. All his understanding of violence is very similar to mine. It's some sacred ideal that the culture believes in, and he studies the Middle Eastern people, and you can't shake them from it. But the concept of cultural lag, where certain ideas hold on even after they're obsolete. Have you ever heard that term, cultural lag? And it's similar to what they say, that old theories never die until what?
Until the funerals?
No, until the theorists die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they hold on to, even though there's a whole new generation, even Einstein held on to certain theories that were wrong, as it turns out, when the new generation of physicists came along. So you hook on to a certain theory when you're very young, and that becomes the basis of your training. And then there's a new theory that comes along, let's say that the pyramid, that clashes with that theory. And the only way the theory in the general world changes is when the old theorists die. Mm-hmm. So this is a problem. But my idea is still that I can get people to understand my theory, and your reaction to that thing was very important, because I took the idea a step further than I ever took it before. I looked over the notes of our lecture. I took notes, I listened to it again. And it's kind of rigid. I'm constantly talking about First World War, sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. But it's more subtle to say that the purpose of war is to get the person to die in the name of your belief system. You're taking the theory a step further, a step deeper, and it's not so mechanical.
Don't be, and I'm not saying this, I'm saying this out of respect for your work. Don't be afraid to apply your own theory to the wars that we like. That's what Revolutionary War, all these other wars, it doesn't make them bad. You're just you're dispassionately, objectively analyzing the experience of fighting for your nation. even when it's a result that you like.
As I
You see what I
say,
mean?
as I say to some people that ask me to do all these things, I'm already over. Why don't you do it?
I'm not saying you have to do the research. I'm just saying don't be afraid to believe that may actually apply to all wars, not just the wars that are the ugly ones that we don't like, you know?
I'm sure it is. It may be, but I'm not willing to say that until I actually. The Civil War is actually a better example, because there it's clear, and that it's very clear that Lincoln was killing for an ideal. The revolution was a little more it was for freedom, okay, but in David Lincoln, in Abraham Lincoln's case, he was killing in order to disprove the idea of slavery. Now I use him as example once in a while. I do this once in a while, but that gets a reaction. They say, "How dare you throw in Abraham Lincoln with Hitler, etc." But the fun, I'm not saying you're wrong that the general principle doesn't apply in many cases, but I'm saying I'm a scientist and I have to do research. I've done some research on Lincoln, and there is another scholar who writes on Lincoln that uses my work, but I can't come out in public, David. I can say to you that maybe you're right, but it's not like when I'm writing something in public.
You want to read all the different firsthand accounts of
the other research, not only the firsthand accounts, the other opinions. I do respect other scholars.
How could your theory be correct if people can just have wars outside of that desire for sacrifice? That would invalidate your theory if you say that there's wars.
Well, fine. As I say, you can do that research for me. That's what it means to have followers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that can do the research. There's that the goal, apparently, when you become an accepted scientist, you have followers who carry out your work and explore other things. Up to now, I've been too brutal in terms of the way I approach people. Okay. When I write on my newsletter, it's like, this is the way it is. And I don't give a fuck whether you care or not, because I need to write this for myself. Okay. And
why do you need to write it?
Well, that's a good question. Okay. Now you're going to hear something very frightening. So I was in analysis for 5 years by the head of the Harvard psychiatry department. I was very, very lucky to find him when he was young. I didn't even know he was head of the psychiatry department. This guy is smarter than any scholar I've ever read. He never wrote anything on psychoanalysis. He's actually a biochemist as well. He has a PhD in biochemistry, and he has a $100 million company doing biochemistry. So when I asked him, why don't you talk about it? He says, what would I write about? So I know psychoanalysis from being in psychoanalysis. So at one point, I came into analysis. So the first thing an analyst does is ask you about your dreams. And I said, well, what did you dream about? I said, I don't have my own dream, but I have my mother's dream. Now, that was symbolic, but it was actually practical, because my mother told me about a dream that she had where I was in the cellar bleeding into her arms. So as it turns out, my mother had a dream, not that she didn't love me in a certain way, that I would always be suffering and bleeding in order to keep her alive in her arms. The blood would go into her body politic from my body. So this is the basis of all my writing, this fantasy of my mother. So somehow, in order to preserve my own life, and you'll see it, some of the titles, the blood of the soldier goes into the body of the nation. In order to preserve my own life somehow, I had to do this thing. And part of it was rescuing myself, and rescuing other young men who were about to act out the same fantasy of going to war and bleeding for their mother country. You notice Putin uses the word mother country continually. These symbols are not by chance. So this is the bedrock of my work, which is the symbolism of the mother. And this is why I'm not so optimistic about the violence of mother. It's not exactly violence. It's the wish to create suffering so the child stays close to the mother, so he cannot separate, so he will be over. And, you know, I'm sure you've read clinical studies of men who can't leave their mothers behind, you know, her tied to their mothers. So yeah, that's where I learned the sacrificial fantasy. So somehow writing about this sacrificial fantasy continually, and don't think it's fun for me to write about the pyramids and the Aztecs and Nazi Germany and Lenin. It all derives from this basic fantasy of bleeding, giving your life energy to another organism, which is the mother, but then it's generalized to become countries and whatever you want to put it. And that's the history of the human race. Now, what's happening now is by going out into the world, and that's why I was so isolated, because I was dealing with this fantasy. By going out into the world now, by talking to you, it's another level of me self-overcoming, as Nietzsche would put it, because now I'm sharing this idea in an interpersonal context. I'm connecting with other human beings, which is very important for me now, as opposed to just writing. I could go on writing forever. And as I say, it's not like everybody say, oh, I dig it. I understand your theory now, Koenigsberg. I accept it. So what you're saying may very well be true, that there's a basic enlarged fantasy that would apply to every war. But I still am a scholar. You know, my peer group is mostly other scholars. And you would have, like you said, I would have to read what other scholars have said about specific wars. I've already, if you look at one, the thing where I have the gravestones, which is in some way my most radical idea. And I put about 4, you can look at that, you probably have it. I put about 8 different conflicts, and I'm saying the gravestones apply to all of them. And I actually go on to say, and again, this is the first time I've ever said this on the radio, I'm saying the purpose of war is those gravestones. Because nobody knows why they fought First World War. The greatest scholars, not Jay Bernstein, who's dead, by the way, the guy who made The Great War in the 20th Century, the most beautiful documentary about World War I, Jay Winters. He has a passage after 50 years of research. It solved no problems. It destroyed every country. There was no reason for it. So the only reason that's reasonable, which is my hypothesis, that it was done to create the tombstones and the gravestones to show that men were willing to die for their country. Now, I would like to see that idea. I would like to have a dialogue with some scholar and tell me, no scholar, this is a strange, has ever told me I'm wrong about anything. To me, in my mind, they're hiding. They're frightened. Now you're a pretty tough guy. That you're different than most of the scholars. I could see that when I see you do your interviews. When you introduce yourself, you're very loud, you know, and you're very strong, and so you're not that frightened as most scholars. So
why do you think they're frightened by your work?
Because this whole idea that these wars
are terrifying. Yeah, it's terrifying.
Terrified. These wars are meaningless. The World War was nothing. It was nothing. It was for no reason at all. Mm-hmm. and they were just running into, it seems so obvious. They were running into machine gun fire for 4 years. The filmmakers understand this. Stanley Kubrick understands this. Peter Weir understands this, but they just
because what you're trying to help people see, and this is just my own, this is why I agree with your work, is I think if I don't see any contradiction with what you've done with Rene Girard's work, but I don't want to go there unless you want to. But
it's only because he never talks about the soldier.
Yeah, but you're just extending his framework to the soldier. He doesn't do enough with war. That's true. But he would say that war is a sacrificial ritual. He just doesn't touch it too specifically. You're right.
Okay, I would simply say that he is not one of my major influences. I was at this point with Norman O'Brown, who wrote Life Against Death. In the last chapter of Life Against Death, if you look at it, he talks about these issues of sacrifice. So Rene Girard, I've read his book, several of his books, and I quote one recently, The Tomb. You see, he says the civilization started as a tomb. So the tomb is the dead person who is sacrificed.
It doesn't matter whether you're influenced by him or not. If something is true, you're going to arrive at the same destination, even if you're going on a different path up the mountain. That's what I'm getting at.
But the difference is he did not emphasize, he did not have he says the scapegoat is an outsider, and Carolyn Marvin, she takes off from him too, but she says the fundamental victim is the insider.
Well, Girard says that the scapegoat is an insider and an outsider at once. That's what he says.
Okay.
So he's both insider and outsider, like someone, like, for example, and he uses the example of when they would capture foreign slaves, right? They would give them food and local customs from the local community. They would even give them orgies with the local girls. They would do all kinds of things to get some of the local community essence into their foreign captured victim. And then they would sacrifice them once they had tasted of the local foods, done the local customs, had, relations with the local girls. That put enough insiderness, so to speak, into their foreign captured slave to make them an effective sacrifice for the community. So I think Girard is in agreement with you on that.
So Carolyn Marvin is the only person who is as radical as I am. She says sacrificial delegates become murderers so we can kill them more easily. So basically, she's saying that we turn soldiers into murderers so that we can then feel justified in sacrificing them. She's very blunt. Now, the story of Carolyn Marvin, to finish up, because her, now I started writing, again, forget about priority, I'm living in the present. I first wrote about this I first presented on this in 1990 in a panel with, in 1988 actually, with Bamik Volkin, who is this world famous political person who does political psychology. I did a panel in 1990 with Gene Elshtain. I wrote a book in 1996 called Dying for the Country. And then in 1999, David, I was at a conference, and I accomplished a lot at these conferences. And a guy generously just came up to me and he said, I think you should read this book. And it was by Carolyn Marvin, Blood, Sacrifice, and the Nation. And he was right. It's a great book, probably the greatest book of the 20th century. And then I started connecting with Carolyn Marvin. And I can even remember the dialogue. I said to her, this is such an important book. It's a greater book than anything Girard had written. And I can still remember her response. Do you realize what you're saying? For a young scholar to say that you're greater than somebody that was considered so great at that time, that was a big deal. You realize what you're saying? So she had such hopes to become famous, etc. So I met her in 1990, 2000. This would be a year after she wrote the book. She came to the Holocaust conference, and right there at the book exhibit, we had a 1-hour conversation, and we agreed on most things, not on everything. And since then, she wrote a couple more important pieces. but she's never followed up on this idea. And few people have. There's one lady who has, but it's like Darwin wrote on natural selection and nobody wrote about it. This is where I use the term terrified. And she's a full professor at University of Pennsylvania. So she sees no value. You know, I'm a fanatic, and as I say, I have to do this. She sees no value in promoting her idea. She actually one of the few people that actually opted out of my listserv, of my eye contact. Like, she don't want to hear from me. Leave me alone. I'm safe now. So recently, I've been sending things to her. And she don't send them back, showing the relationship between my idea and her idea. But finally, it comes down to, you also have a personality. So I have a life. So whether my theories are similar to hers, whether my theories are similar to Gerard, my goal now is to become a personality. It's not like Jordan Peterson, when he goes out there, says, oh, yes, and this theory is good too, and this theory is good too, or Howard Bloom. He is Howard Bloom. He gives his theories. Right. So in some way, I'm too conscientious a scholar. You might say, as Maya says, you're a weakling, you're a weakling, you're a weakling, you know, because I want, you know, I was trained to give credit to other scholars. But in some way, I'm trying to abandon that now.
Right.
To come out as just Richard Koenigsberg, the way Jordan Peterson came out, the way Zizek came out. And it's to say, I'm not as brilliant as these men, but my ideas are more radical, okay? Because I'm on this one basic track of this theory of war and genocide. I would never
familiar with Robert Pape's Dying to Win about suicide terrorism?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that fits with this overall theme that we're exploring, because he identifies the common reason strategically and psychologically why people are willing to do suicide terrorism is not because of any other factor primarily, except for the perception of being occupied by a foreign power. And that would be in keeping with your framework of saying, you know, if you perceive your body as being invaded by a hostile, you know, body, then you feel the need to destroy your body in the service of protecting your local body from being predatorily, you know, eradicated by a hostile occupational force.
I thought, again, I thought you were going to say dying to win is, again, the simplest hypothesis, parsimony, is you win by dying. So all these other things may be true about the body politic, protecting the complicated geopolitical issues may be true.
It's not complicated. A person who blows himself up feels as if they are in a state of being occupied by a foreign body. That's it, just like you're saying.
The foreign body being Allah?
No, it would be perception of, like with the Middle East, the reason why people, you know, Osama bin Laden said, we're going to do suicide terrorism because you've been occupying our holy lands, and you've been occupying our traditional holy lands that we consider to be sacred. And you guys are Westerners who do not share our respect for Allah. You're occupying our places with your military bases. And that feels as if a foreign body is occupying their body, and they want to purge that foreign body. So therefore they eliminate their own body. It's dying to win. It's in keeping with what you're saying.
I'm not good at listening to you. I understand what you're saying now, but look what great success they've had. I'm saying the whole idea that these are practical things, that's what I'm objecting to. It's not, they could have done a much better job in getting their freedom if they hadn't gone around blowing up Israel's, and you know, that's the way things work in the quote real world. People negotiate, and then they solve their problems. So whether blowing yourself up may have the psychological effect of killing the foreign object within your own body, but it's not practical.
But it's a way of, in your frame of looking at it, it's a way of symbolically performing the experience that they want to happen to your foreign national body, which is to blow it up, right? So they're saying, I'm going to show you how fervently I want to preserve my nation's body, local body, that I will blow up my own body to show you how serious I am in the belief that your body must be exploded. You know what I mean? It's a symbolic performance of what they want to happen to America or whoever else they perceive to be a foreign occupier.
Okay. But the fundamental thing is blowing up their own body.
Exactly.
In order, this gets into the concept of the internalized object. The object exists within your own body. So the Jew was inside Hitler. This is why he could never he could never relieve himself, because the Jew outside was a projection of the Jew inside his body. And again, it was symbolic. The Jew inside his body was the person that was saying, I don't believe in this thing. It's stupid. Why am I doing this? Why am I? The Jew is his voice of rationality that's saying, why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you wanting to expand? Why are you spending your life? Why don't you just spend more time with Eva Braun? So the Jew spoke the truth to Hitler, that what he was doing was wrong, and he couldn't bear to hear that. So he had to blow up the Jew. Now, he externalized the Jew. That's called projection. He took the Jew inside his own mind, telling him, speaking to him, telling him what you're doing is wrong. And he projected it. And then he had to kill the voice of the Jew. And that's why the world conquest had to do with having to kill every Jew, because he could, it's like people that want to make $1 billion, right? It could never be enough. You never have enough. You're always poor, even if you have $10 billion in your heart. As that song goes, the dream remains the same. It doesn't change, that fantasy of being impoverished. And so for Hitler, he was killing the voice of reason. And I had that problem too. I'm going to, the German in me, or whatever that thing is, the Nazi in me, is constantly competing with my voice of rationality, the Jew. So the basic ideology, you don't need this book by Snyder, by the way. This guy is a Mountebank, a word I've never used in the last 20 or 30 years. This guy was getting 1,000 reviews, writes all this nonsense, and he de-emphasizes anti-Semitism. It has to do with the puns or whatever. I don't know if you've read his stuff or read about it. He's world famous now, Timothy Snyder. So actually, if you wanted to understand Nazism, you could do it in 2 words: kill Jews. That's it. That's what he believed in most deeply. That's why he attacked the Soviet Union. I'm thinking of the song, Where the Girls Are, where the Jews are. Why did he stop his fight with England? Because that was not the source of the Jewish Bolshevik bacteria. In his mind, Jewish Bolshevik bacteria were seeping in from Soviet Union. So that's why he attacked. So getting back, kill Jews. So kill Jews means 2 parts of the self. The Jew is a part of me that's talking to you now, trying to understand these things as a normal, intellectual, rational person. But the other side of my brain is the Nazi that's trying to kill the rational part of me. And I guarantee you, after we're done, he will take over again. But of course, I couldn't understand this.
How would he take over again when we're done?
Because all the energy of my intellect and rationality is exhausted, and I've resisted him, but he would come back, because the right part of my brain, if you want to look at the way brain functioning, the right part of the brain is the emotional part, the left part is the intellect. It would just be, he would come back. We'll see. Maybe I will be victorious. But as the Buddhists say, you go in 1,000 fights to rid yourself of the the negative voice, the whatever it is.
Telling you that you're bad or telling you you're not doing a good job, that kind of stuff, right?
Right. And then you have to go into the arena again and again. So the fact that I'm doing this with you, now Meha said, I'm lucky that this happened, but I have 5 people on my rack now that I'm going to have another talk in a week with someone else who's been following my work for many years. So yes, this is a breakthrough, but it's not like I wasn't ready. I wasn't strong enough to begin having normal conversations with people.
Who told you that you're not strong enough? I mean, I see strength here.
Yeah. Well, it's been a lot of work. Yeah, well, I'm doing better. But if you listen to the last conversation we had, you will say you almost didn't talk.
Who, me?
It was your job to interview me, right? But I would have been incapable of having listening to you in any respect now. It was just you asked the questions, and they were very good questions. I didn't know you understood my work that well, because I looked back over the transcript. And you did occasionally bring something in about your own personal life. I remember about your father or uncle in Florida who built some contraption, and then they came in from him and they thought he was related to the Nazis, and he spent 2 days in jail. So I'm not saying you didn't talk about yourself, but the fact that I remember that story means that there wasn't that much you talked about yourself. I remember, and you invited me actually 3 years ago to come down to Florida. May I still criticizing you? Why didn't I accept that?
Yeah. Well, hey, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. I think we've covered enough here for today. So I thank you for your time, and I want people to visit your website, libraryofsocialscience.com, libraryofsocialscience.com, where you can subscribe to your newsletter by putting in your email. So I thank you for your time. Sure.
Okay. And we have to figure out a way of promoting things together. Okay. Yeah. This is part, because I have this list and I would like this to go out. I'm not going to just give it away for free on my newsletter. So I hope we can continue our dialogue, and we will also work on the issues of how to promote things through the internet, which I know you know how to do.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your time.
Take care, David. Thank you.